In the election of 1864, which took place in the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln only lost 3 states: Delaware, New Jersey, and Kentucky. Join us today for a discussion with a KHS research fellow who has written a book about the Democratic Party in the Civil War. He will help us understand why so many Kentuckians embraced the Democratic Party and the course that Democrats hoped the Civil War would take, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Kentucky Chronicles is inspired by the work of researchers from across the world who have conducted research at the Kentucky Historical Society, or who have contributed to the scholarly journal, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which has been published continuously since 1903. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. I would like to welcome you all today to the 4th of our Fellow Talks. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. J. Matthew Gallman. Dr. J. Matthew Gallman is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Florida. Dr. Gallman holds a BA from Princeton and a PhD from Brandeis University. He's written books including Mastering Wartime, A Social History of Philadelphia During the Civil War, America's Joan of Arc, The Life of Anna Elizabeth Dickinson, and Defining Duty in the Civil War, Personal Choice, Popular Culture, and the Union Homefront. Dr. Gallman received a fall 2016 fellowship at KHS, which he used to help write his article, What is the Case of Willie Waller at Maysville, Kentucky? The Strange Tale of a Kentucky Rebel, which appeared in the winter 2019 edition of the Register. More recently, Dr. Gallman wrote The Cacophony of Politics, Northern Democrats and the American Civil War, published with the University of Virginia Press in 2021. So welcome.
Thank you.
I've recently talked with fellows who are at various stages of their academic careers. You had already written quite a few books before embarking on The Cacophony of Politics. What led you to begin researching and writing this book? And I think for some of our listeners, does it get easier over time to settle on a topic and write, or does each book project present its own set of challenges?
I've written quite a few books. In fact, I just retired at the end of last year. So I'm still plugging along, but technically retired. I've spent a lot of my time, not everything, I've done other things too, but a lot of my time writing on the Civil War home front and social issues. So I've written about gender and a bit on race and a bit on labor and so on, but I have never written about politics. And I've written a little bit about Lincoln, but only a little bit. So I decided to try my hand at telling a political story, but trying to do kind of my version of what political history could look like or should look like. That's why I decided to do this book. It was challenging because there's too much to read everything. It wouldn't make a good, dissertation or something, but I didn't want it to be entirely synthetic. I didn't want it to be purely reading secondary literature and writing a summary. So it was kind of a challenging kind of book to write.
I do want to get into the book itself. So in The Cacophony of Politics, you explore how Northern Democrats dealt with the Civil War. And I know this is a broad question, so you can sort of tackle it from whatever sort of angle you would like. But for listeners who aren't as familiar with Civil War era politics, who were Northern Democrats? And in broad terms, how did they view the election of Lincoln and the onset of the Civil War?
I would say for folks who are, know their history but don't really know the politics of the Civil War that well, there are a couple obvious things to keep in mind. One is that the Republican Party was brand new, whereas the Democratic Party had been around since the 20s. So it, in the terms of the day, was a long-standing party with its own traditions and its own kind of long view and so on. And then the other big thing that we tend to lose track of is that the Democratic Party up until 1860 was a national party with a very powerful Southern wing. So once Lincoln wins and the South secedes, my Democrats have lost, a huge chunk of their colleagues. But also that means the Democrats no longer have to appease or appeal to Democrats from South Carolina and Louisiana. So it becomes a different thing. So that all kind of shapes the story, I think. Another thing I think which people should keep in mind is that in 1864, was the war going pretty well, the Democrats still got 45% of the vote. And only a few months earlier, Abraham Lincoln, who was a very savvy guy, predicted that the Democrats would win the election. So I think that we tend to see Lincoln's reelection as fairly much a foregone conclusion. It was, in many senses, a toss-up election that ended up going. It went more easily for the Republicans than they had expected months earlier.
Those numbers kind of blew me away even when I was reading the book. And I think you mentioned in one of the concluding chapters how tight the election was. But when you hit 45% or the exact number that you just mentioned, that's a lot of people voting for the opposition party. I mean, that's still relatively tight. A relatively tight election. Which does lead me to my next question, which is what I really enjoyed in the Cacophony of Politics was how diverse a group Northern Democrats actually were in terms of their beliefs and their approach to the Civil War. Why do you think we should focus on regional differences? And what was the difference between a Democrat who lived, just broadly speaking, in New York and one who lived in Indiana? And why might we see them somewhat differently instead of just labeling them all as copperheads?
Well, for starters, I mean, yeah, one of the big points of this book is that, the Democrats were very diverse in where they were and what they thought and what they valued most principally. All that matters. When I came to the Kentucky Historical Society, I did come to work on this book as well as to work on Willie Waller. And one reason I did that is that, Kentucky is a really interesting example of a state that is kind of diverse in different ways. Something like 20-25% of the population were enslaved. You've got one in 5 white Kentuckians were slave owners. But also the census shows that a pretty large percentage of Kentuckians had family ties to further south. I mean, if we want to call Kentucky a southern state, a lot of these people came from further south, and all of which reflects things that made the Democratic Party diverse, even though in this particular state it was sort of atypical. Most Northerners not only had never seen a slave, but I think most Northerners almost never interacted with an African American. That's another kind of simple fact that we tend to not know, that outside of the slave states, the percentage of people in the northern states beyond the border states was only 1.5% black, and those people were not particularly well distributed. So if you kind of lived in Indiana, you were not going to see black people in your daily lives, which I think is another kind of huge variable in terms of how they thought about politics, how they thought about race, and so on. So yeah, they're all over the place in diverse ways.
That was one of my big takeaways I think I got from the book, was just regionalism matters and sort of where people are at, as you just mentioned, which does lead into my next question. You sort of answered this partially. One thing that struck me when reading was how Kentucky pops into the narrative so often. When you see the words Northern Democrats in the title, you don't think Kentucky. Right. But can you tell our listeners a little bit more, and as you were elaborating on before, just why Kentuckians play such an important role in the book? Before
coming to Kentucky Historical Society, I had a fellowship and I spent a lot of time at Huntington, massive 19th century collection where they've got lots of Democrats, and I spent a lot of time reading the personal papers of Democrats. I wanted to come to Kentucky because I was convinced that Kentucky matters in understanding the United States politics, and also to find these Democratic voices. One of my friends read the book and said I had too much Philadelphia in it, which I had another grant to have me spend a couple of weeks in Philadelphia. Whereas, for instance, I didn't go to Boston. I was going to go to Boston and things happened and I couldn't. But reality is that Boston, even though there are Democrats in Boston, the Democrats were not as important to Massachusetts as they were to Philadelphia or New York or Kentucky. So I guess that's why I opted to write about Kentucky. Although, my goal was to give a flavor of diversity. even though I wouldn't argue Kentucky was typical, but it was certainly interesting and important.
And I think you do a good job of tracing that out throughout the book, because it is challenging. Kentucky presents so many different sort of issues to look at. I mean, a heavily Whig state that then just switches by the late 1850s into the Democratic camp, and then just the votes themselves are very, very intriguing.
Really what they are is they're a bunch of Whigs. There's no Whig party. Another kind of number that in 1860, 45% of Kentucky voters voted for Bell, much, much, much more than anywhere else in the North. And I think the answer is pretty simple. It's not really about ideology. It's, I think I say in the book, if you look at a map and you imagine a big civil war, Kentucky's going to be a battleground. People who wanted no part of a war voted for Bell, far more so than people even in Tennessee voted for Bell. And I think that tells us, you look at a map where you got Ohio to the north, you got slave states in all directions except for Ohio, and they're kind of just smack in the middle in a way that is uncomfortable.
It certainly makes it interesting to study. Sort of segueing to the next question, it can be difficult for any political party to challenge the dominant party in the midst of a war. And you mentioned Whigs before. I was thinking Federalists, but Whigs are also sort of a great example of that during the U.S.-Mexican War. Sure. How successful, however you want to define it, was the Democratic coalition in the Civil War at convincing the broader public that Lincoln and the Republicans were misguided?
That is a really interesting question, because surely the Democrats felt that Lincoln was misguided, even though I would argue, in fact, I have argued in other places, that many Democrats perceived Lincoln as being controlled by radicals in his own party, in his own cabinet. And they actually kind of believed Lincoln was sort of a moderate. Although voters, rank and file, not the wire police, but rank and file would see him as kind of a radical, which is, I think, kind of typical in American politics. I don't want to get into contemporary politics, but people see the President of the United States and see him as being a radical, even when he's pretty moderate. And Lincoln, in many ways, was pretty moderate. If you think of the lineup of reasons why Northerners opposed the war, they opposed conscription, both the idea of conscription, but also the way it is implemented. They opposed emancipation, but they also opposed the death. I think a good reason to be opposed to the war is that the death count is just absurd. On the one hand, you could argue the Democrats were arguing against the war successfully to some extent. On the other hand, the very fact that over 700,000 Northerners died during the war, good reason to oppose it, and yet the support continues. Surely some Democrats affected that discourse.
And I think at the very least, it's important to understand their perspective, which you pull out throughout the book. At least you do sort of walk away with that of, okay, here's how a large segment of the population felt during this really important time of American history. And I think it's a group that often gets overlooked. This does lead to my last question. And this is one that I'm just curious as a historian, sort of how you tackle some of these things. Northern Democrats in the Civil War are not typically viewed in a positive light, and they embrace the wide range of policy position that most modern readers would not share. How difficult is it to write a book about individuals, and I'm thinking most heavily of George B. McClellan, who are traditionally seen as either villains or else as incompetent bunglers? What are sort of the challenges of writing a history that presents them before the public, but that also in a way treats them fairly?
Oh, I think it's a huge challenge. It's a challenge in how you write and also kind of how you explain after having written. I mean, I think McClellan, for instance, I present him as being kind of a bonehead when it comes to politics, that he was a general and not really a politician. And, he made kind of some boneheaded calls probably. But I think that as historians choosing topics, I kept telling myself, people have written massive books about Hitler, and that seems to be okay. But I did recognize that, I've written a lot of books. So I recognize that if I write a book about the Democrats, I am somehow going to be perceived as giving a voice to the bad guys, one review said I was being presentist even though I thought I was being actively not presentist. But I do think in writing the story, you've got to at one point say, yeah, these people were pretty racist, but then so were most Republicans. I'm not sure that they're pretty racist was really their defining characteristic when it comes to politics. So, and that's the challenge. And reading the personal papers of people, both famous and not famous and sort of famous, only a few of them, a couple, filled their own letters with kind of racist rhetoric. But editorials are full of racist rhetoric. It's a hard story to tell, I think.
It's a hard story to present because you've got to, take into account so many different perspectives. I mean, I think that was the thing I appreciated when I got to the conclusion of the book, was just how you clearly went to a lot of archives, but you also were able to blend. You brought in Kentucky, so someone who's studying Kentucky feels like, okay, there's something I can understand. But you also in Indiana, and your explanation of New York politics was excellent. So you sort of get, okay, this is what's happening in a major city like New York or Philadelphia, but you also get, okay, here's what's happening in people who see it a little differently in Kentucky or wherever at Indiana.
Or like Chicago. I spent a fair amount of time in Chicago, which we're very political. But I do want to say, as a fellow, I really enjoyed the place. I love the archives. I love the physical plant. I got great help from Patrick Lewis, who I don't think is there anymore. But
no, he's at the Filson now. So
and also his book, and also Stephanie, who I know is there, Stephanie Lang. So. It's a great archive to work in. I would definitely recommend it.
And I do appreciate that, because that's the one thing we've been trying to do with these podcasts is really to look at, okay, here's sort of what fellows do. They come into the building, they collect research. But what I really want to highlight, and what you did so well today at highlighting, was, okay, but here's sort of the final product, either an article, a book. Here's how we get, for us, Kentucky sort of history out there. And how do people sort of see that as being important. And then especially for the Kentucky Historical Society, to the broader narrative of the Civil War, which is, I liked how you sort of pulled all that together.
That was a pleasant visit, great archive. I think it certainly helped the final product a lot.
Thank you so much. I will close this out by saying that is Dr. J. Matthew Gallman, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Florida. We hope that you will all check out his excellent book, The Cacophony of Politics, Northern Democrats and the American Civil War. I know I enjoyed reading it. I know you all will enjoy reading it as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Gallman.
Thank you very much.
Kentucky's vote for George B. McClellan did not do much for their candidate in 1864, as Abraham Lincoln easily won re-election. Yet Kentucky would become a loyal bastion of the Democratic Party after the Civil War. A Republican candidate would not even win the governor's mansion until 1985. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, J. Matthew Gallman, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society, with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society, with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.